I'm delighted to be with you, to have an opportunity to share a few thoughts with you this morning. When we were on lockdown during the pandemic, the U.S. Census Bureau, the federal agency responsible for monitoring demographic change in our country, released a very important source of information for us. They released the 2020 census. As you know, every 10 years we do a full enumeration of our population. The 2020 census was released when you all were supposed to be at home minding your business. That census enabled us to monitor how our nation changed over the last decade. And since 2020, on an annual basis, the U.S. Census Bureau has released annual population estimates for the year 2021, 2022, and 2023. What I'd like to do for you today is share with you what we know about population change in the last decade and population change during COVID and up until July 1st, 2023. And I want to issue a warning to you that there are some profound, disruptive demographic changes that are going to dramatically transform all of our social, economic, and political institutions. They're going to change the workforce, they're going to change workplaces, and they're going to change consumer markets. And you're going to have to buckle your seatbelt to deal with the changes. And if you ignore them at your own peril. I want to talk about this notion of winning the war for talent. I had a conversation with a CEO that we work with pretty closely at Keenan Flagler, and he said to me, "Jim, I need workers who can keep the alligators off my butt." That's the clean version of it. He said, "I need workers who can groove on ambiguity." So the crucial question becomes, in terms of talent, recruitment, retention, and development, what do you need in your toolkit to groove on ambiguity? Because the nature of the landscape is such that we're in an era of turbulence, huge disruptions. Those other disruptive forces over there that is just the chaotic landscape we find ourselves in the midst of. But there are also some profound disruptive demographic trends. And those trends are pretty predictable. I love my job because demography is one of the most predictable things in the world. I assure you, if you're 5 years old today, 5 years from now, you're going to be 10 years old. Unless you tell a lie. I can't wait every year when I get time for my annual review with my dean, because I walk in and I tell her, "You know, when we met last year, I was 69 years old. You know what? I'm 70 now, and next year when we meet, I'm going to be 71. It's called forecasting. I'm the best in the business." The kinds of changes we find ourselves in the midst of, we call those disruptive changes, and they are part of what I call the new normal of certain uncertainty. That's the nature of the landscape that we're operating in. I want to talk about how do we navigate uncertainty, but contextualize it by talking about what we know about these disruptive demographic trends, that left-hand box on there. How did we behave? What do we know about the last decade and during the pandemic? I want to suggest to you, we know three things: that the population was moving and grooving, it was browning and graying, and it was disappearing and rebelling. I want to talk about each one of those things for you. Moving and grooving is about a profound redistribution of our population regionally in this country, and the key to the story is, the answer is tag. We are it in the South. The South rises again in terms of demographic change. That's how the South is defined on the left-hand side of this graphic by the U.S. Census Bureau, those states in red. You know the history of our region. You know for much of the 20th century, it was an economically backwards region. It had all kinds of problems. As a consequence of that, the South was the place to leave as opposed to the place to come to. Demographically, you can see the impact. If you look at the right-hand side of this graphic, top three bars, you see that between 1910 and 1970, the South only captured about 30% of net national population growth in this country. Why? More people were leaving the region than were coming here. We had two great waves of outmigration. in and around World War I, in and around World War II, people were hightailing it out. So to the extent the region grew, it was an excess of births over deaths. You can grow two ways, more people moving in and leaving, more births than deaths. It was the bedroom boogie, if you will, that drove growth until around 1970. And then around 1970, something profound occurred in our region that has continued until the present. In every decade since 1970, the South has captured about half of net national population growth in this country. Good people, we've gone from a region where we speak two languages, English and bad English, to one today we speak well over 300 different languages. We have become demographically the cat's meow in terms of destination selection. We added about 22.7 million people to our population in the last decade. 2010 to 2020, 51% of that growth is in the South. It is the only region of the country that is experiencing net in-migration from every other region of the country, whether it's the Northeast, the Midwest, the West. Tag, we are it in terms of destination selection around the country. And you ask the question, who's moving here? Right-hand side of the graph, the answer is everybody is moving here. Whites, blacks, Asians, Hispanics, the elderly, the native-born, the foreign-born. It's the only region of the country that has net in-migration from all of those groups. You can't say that about the West. You looked at the West during this period, the only group moving in larger numbers were Asians. You went to the Midwest, the only group moving in larger numbers were Hispanics. And the Northeast was kind of like when the last person leaves, turn off the lights if there's still any on there. It's this profound redistribution of population, transform our community from historically a black-white community to a far more diverse environment. Again, 2010 to 2020, nation grew by 7.4%. The South grew by 10.2%, or 11.7 million newcomers to our region. Very, very slow growth in the Northeast, very, very slow growth in the Midwest. Yes, the West was growing, but nothing like compared to the South in terms of that change. But I lied to you, I said it's the South. During the last decade, this movement was about 5 states within the South. It was about Texas, it was about Florida, it was about Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. Those 5 states, we call them migration magnet states. They captured about 79% of that growth. Doesn't mean the other southern states weren't growing, they just weren't growing anything like those 5 states. 2 of those states are immigrant gateways, Texas and Florida. Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, the new migration magnets in terms of population change and growth in the region. That was 2010 to 2020. You all were supposed to be home, minding your business, behaving quietly at home during the pandemic. What happened? South grew by another 3.8 million people during the period April 1st, 2020 to June 2023. 630,000 people lost in the Northeast, 78,000. The West grew, but as you will see in a moment, that's all due to net excess of births over deaths because people were hightailing it out of the West as well. And the South changed again. Instead of just Texas, Florida, Georgia, Virginia dropped out. What added in? South Carolina and Tennessee became the migration magnet states. Of that 3.8 million people, 94% of it concentrated in those states in terms of destination, 6% of growth in other southern states. And it's all migration for the most part that's driving that growth. The blue, you see Tennessee added about 140,000 people. 100% of it is due to migration. Again, not excess births over deaths. They're all newcomers. We're going to call them pandemic refugees, if you will, the large number of people moving to our region. You want to see how big this thing was? On the right-hand side, this is the number of migrants that were moving to these destinations. Florida got 985 people every day during the pandemic. Texas, 789, North Carolina, 307,000. Tennessee was getting 195 people every day during the pandemic because you had all of these people who were fleeing major urban centers and the like. We're looking for smaller town and regional, amenity-rich kinds of places within the South. Huge growth. Where were they leaving? California's losing 800-some-thousand people, 864 people every day. New York, about 687 people. You began to see how this major redistribution was transforming communities. What did it do? All of those pandemic refugees, or most of them, arrived with a lot of juice, a lot of financial juice. So you got benefit in terms of consumer purchasing power, tax revenues and the like from those newcomers, but they created a huge housing affordability crisis for you. A crisis where the very people who are hired to protect public health and safety and educate our kids and take care of us cannot afford to live in the very places that they're supposed to be doing the work. I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and during the pandemic, I was in my yard, my dog and I, and one of my neighbors was walking her dog. And she says, I haven't seen you in a long time. She says, and I hate to tell you that we're leaving. And she said, her husband was assistant football coach at Carolina. He says, we're going to Florida. He's taking a job at Florida. And she says, we put our house on the market yesterday morning at 9 a.m., and at 9:15, we had 3 full-price offers for the house, sight unseen. And she said, and one of the suitors noticed that we were scheduled to have an open house the next day, and they called and said, we will give you an additional $50,000 cash if you don't have the open house tomorrow. My dog's named Cooper. Cooper said, yo. I said, did you hear just what she said? I said, yeah. He said, you notice they're going that way, right? I said, yeah. He said, you notice their house is that way, right? I said, yeah. I said, so what's up? He said, we need to go down there and get that sign out of their yard and put it in ours. I say that as an example, but because this was the gold rush, if you will, in terms of housing and the like, it drove up housing such that I have a school that we built in Durham, North Carolina for disadvantaged kids. We had 4 homeless teachers in Durham, all with master's degrees, because they could not afford, there was nothing affordable for them. If we don't fix this problem, we're going to be in deep yogurt because we need all hands on deck to do things. Let me see, go back here. So when you look at that 3.5 million people coming to the South, 3.8 million, 3.5 of it is these newcomers. The births over deaths only accounted for about 330,000 of that growth. That's what I'm talking about. It's migration driven in terms of the change. And it's about 2/3 of it is domestic migrants, but international migrants are playing a role too, contributing to that diversity, and we're going to need them all moving forward and all of this change. Now, what about happened to your region, your MidSouth region? You lost about 10,000 people since 2020, about 1% loss. If you look at Tennessee, boom, 3.1% growth, outperforming the nation. About the same as the South. Mississippi lost population. Arkansas grew by 1.2%, but the region itself lost about 10,000 people during that time. And where does that growth? Shelby County, major loss, 19,000, declined almost 20,000, 2.1%. Lauderdale County lost population. Crittenden County, Arkansas lost population. Where was your growth? Fayette, Tipton, and DeSoto in terms of the change. So you got uneven kind of growth within your region, but the overarching thing is population loss for the region. And Shelby, in terms of absolute change, a decline of 19,000. It's what happens in Shelby County, Tennessee, that drives most of the change in the growth in your region. You see in terms of those, the sources of that growth. Much of it is due to migration, whether it's population loss or population growth, is driven by migration in your region, in or out. And you can develop a typology of what happens in your region when you look at the sources of growth, natural change, more births than deaths or less, whatever, and then net migration. What you will see with Shelby County is your loss is due to migration. You had some excess of births over deaths, but the out-migration supersedes your net change, natural change. So you're an emptying out kind of community demographically. And you go down this list and you see how your various constituent counties impacted. Now, please don't be offended when I say that your county is dying. But what that means is more people are leaving your community than are moving in, and there are more deaths than births. Demographically, you're losing population. Some people get offended that somebody called my chancellor and said, I said their community was dying and I ought to die. And I said, well, I am sooner or later, but please don't be offended. I'm just giving you the demographic realities of the way things are going. And so, your sources of migration are predominantly domestic migrants, and you get some growth from international migrants. You're going to want to keep that again, but you have uneven growth and population loss for your region as a whole. So we're moving and grooving. We're also browning and graying at the same time that we're moving and grooving. Moving and grooving is geographic. Browning and graying is about compositional changes in our population. I always say there are two colorful processes that transform our communities. I want to talk about them separately and then bring them back together for you and what they mean for one in the war on talent. Browning is about immigration-driven population change in our country. This is a graphic of immigrants in our country from 1900 to 2018. You will note in this graphic that we kept immigration pretty low in our country until around 1960 or 1970. You see that huge uptake in the number of immigrants in our country after 1960. 1965 is an important year in our immigration history because prior to 1965, we had an immigration law that says if we were going to allow the foreign-born to enter our country, it was important that they not upset the existing racial and ethnic balance of our country as it existed at the turn of the 20th century. So we had an express preference for people who were phenotypically similar to Anglo-Saxons, which means that we operated on a quota system that was geographically discriminatory against people from certain regions of the world. For example, you go back to the 1880s, you will notice something codified into law called the Chinese Exclusion Law. They shouldn't be allowed to come to America because it would be, quote unquote, difficult to assimilate into mainstream society. If you fast forward to the first decade of the 20th century, you'll see something called the Asiatic Barrier region that included Japan. They shouldn't be allowed to come to America because it would be difficult to assimilate. And we justified those laws based on a series of racist theories about cultural inferiority. So we control the composition of our population through our immigration law. That all changed in 1965, coincidence with the civil rights movement and domestic life. We liberalized our immigration law via something called the Hart-Celler Act of 1975. What did it do? It eliminated those discriminatory provisions based on geographic origin, opening up the doors of our country to people who heretofore had not been allowed to come in large numbers. Basically people from Asia, increasingly people from Latin America and the Middle East. These are all people of color who are phenotypically different from the Anglo-Saxon model. So browning of America, takeaway number one, fundamental shift in geographic origin. Takeaway number two, fundamental shift in phenotype. Takeaway number three, the numbers changed dramatically over that period. Prior to 1965, we only allowed about 200,000 legal immigrants to enter the country on an annual basis. Right after 1965, we increased the number to about 500,000, subsequently to about 800,000. Right before the pandemic, about 1 million people entering the country on an annual basis, all contributing to the growing diversity of our population. So when you ask the question, at 44.7 million people, who are they? About 44% of them are Hispanic. You'll note that the second largest number are Asian at about 27%. The non-Hispanic white share, which would be equivalent to the old immigrants that arrived, it was at 17 or 18%. When I talk about and characterize the browning of America, I'm talking about this fundamental shift in origin. If you looked at these numbers prior to 1965, they would have been reversed because of the way our immigration law works. If you ask yourself then what is driving change, it is this fundamental shift in the composition of the immigrant pool. You could see the impact as early as the turn of the new millennium, 2000 to 2010. We added 27 million people to our population during that period. You will note that of that 27 million people, 15.2 million of them were Hispanic. You note that the non-Hispanic white share was about 1.2 million people. The white population grew by 1.2% when the Hispanic population was growing by 43%. Between those two yellow lines and inclusive of the bottom yellow line, those are all people of color. You'll note double-digit growth in all of them except American Indians and Alaskan Natives. It's at 8.6%. When I'm talking about the browning of America, that's what I'm talking about, this fundamental shift in sources of growth in our population and our country. A little bit closer to home, 2010 to 2017, the total population grew by 5.6%. 1%. You'll note that the non-Hispanic white population grew by 0.4%. Where did the growth all occur? All to the right of the purple bar among blacks, immigrants, Pacific Islands, Hispanics, and Asians. That is what's transforming our population. And the 2020 census showed us something that we never anticipated that would occur in America. For the first time in history, the non-Hispanic white population declined by 5.1 million people. And it doesn't matter what region of the country you look at, we had white population loss for the first time in our history during that period. Is this fundamental shift in the composition of our population that's driving change and has enormous implications for our workforce. 35 states lost white population during the last decade. Only 15 states, Tennessee is included, had any white population growth, plus the District of Columbia. We're talking about a profound kind of compositional shift in our population. That means if you add 22.7 million people to your population during the last decade, all of that growth is driven by people of color. Why? Because the non-Hispanic white population declined by 5.1 million people. You look and see some of those regions and the rate of that growth. 100% non-white, 51% of it the Hispanic share. If we're going to win the war for talent, we need to understand how the compositional shift of our population impacts that war for talent. The other thing contributing to the browning of America is a fundamental shift in marriage patterns. You know, until 1967, it was illegal for blacks and whites to marry. That all changed. And after 1967, you see this profound shift in out marriage or intermarriage. Means you marry someone of a different racial or ethnic group that you belong to. Went from 3% in 1967 to about 17% in 2015. A little bit later data for all married couples and the like. Marrying, mixed marriages, if you will. Crucial question is, who the heck is doing all this hooking up in strange ways here? About 42% of those marriages are between Hispanics and whites, about 15% of them are between Asians and whites, and about 14% of the cases both married partners are non-white. Note that black-white relationships are the smaller share at 11%. There's this other group, I don't know who the heck they are, but they're hooking up and they're having fun. What's the significance here? One of the most rapidly growing populations that we have today is the mixed race population. It grew by came to about 33.8 million by 2022, and a 76% increase. What's the significance? These people feel like they're invisible in the workforce. Nobody recognizes their existence in the life. It's 33.8 million people. Don't be a fool. Don't lose that population. Understand, embrace that population if we're going to win the war for talent in society there. And that white population loss continued post-2020 census. White population by July 2023 declined by another 2.1 million people. All of the growth is in the yellow, if you will, on this graphic. That kind of compositional change, transformation. What happened in your region? You had white, Native American, American Indian, not Hispanic, all races decline. Where was your growth? Among blacks, among non-whites in general, among Asians, among Hispanics, the mixed race population. You are a microcosm of what's going on in the nation as a whole. It's a strength if you want to view it as that way, and it's something you need to build on if you're going to win the war for talent. So browning, immigration driven, out marriage driven. At the same time that we're browning, we're also graying. And graying is about the native-born population and the aging of the population. I know I always get this question, well, how do I know if I'm part of the graying of America? It's 4 ways. Number 1, if you have difficulty seeing this screen, you're part of the graying of America. Number 2, if you got to go to the restroom twice during this presentation, you're part of the graying of America. And number 3, if you fall asleep, it's not even noon yet, you're part of the graying of America. Graying of America is about 3 things. It's about changes in longevity, it's about declining fertility, it's about a group of us born between 1946 and 1964. We're the boomer generation. Let's look at each one of these things. We're living much longer today than we ever envisioned in our history. When we introduced Social Security in America in 1935, the average person turning 65 that year was going to live another 12.7 years. That same person turning 65 today is going to live another 18.7 years. And we now think living to 100 on a routine basis is well within reach, and there's one school of thought that says the person who lived to 130 has already been born. Why? We got major medical advances that do what? Extend our lives, right? You all are eating better some of the time, right? You all are exercising some of the time. And we got this thing now called regenerative medicine. We have a scientist in North Carolina that has regenerated a bladder. So your bladder wear out, we'll sell you another one. Just tell me what color you want. And around the world, we're working on every body part now. One of the biggest, hottest entrepreneurial opportunities is the longevity economy, developing innovations to accommodate an aging population. All this work about these blue zones where people live forever is a major thing, development there. We had about 82,000 centenarians in 2016. We're forecasting about 589,000 by 2060 in the U.S. 1950, about 34,000 centenarians globally. In 2020, there were 573,000 of those folks. This notion of aging and longevity is something that's really, really big. The other thing that's driving aging is a decline in fertility in our country and globally. Ladies, what happened when you all had the audacity to become all educated and career-oriented? What happened to the age of marriage? It goes up, right? When the age of marriage goes up, what happens to the age of first childbirth? Goes up. When those two things go up together, what happens to your biological clock? It gets constrained, right? All you have to do, if you don't believe this, is look at your own family. Go back and look at your great-grandmother. I guarantee you she had 2,000 kids. Your grandma, 200. Your mom, you and somebody else. And then there's you. It's that precipitous drop in fertility. So as women entered the labor market and became career-oriented, it resulted in a delay in childbearing, constraining the number of years that is safe to have children. And then we have a group of women they call the voluntary childless. They choose and opt voluntarily not to have children. The last piece of it, there's something in demography, this blue box, called completed fertility. I don't have time to give you the big theory on it. Let me give you the pop version. Ladies, completed fertility is when you tell your husband, go take out the trash, ain't nothing else happening here. And completed fertility for women occurs between the ages of 40 and 44. There's this precipitous drop in fertility. What's going on in America? The number of women who are moving into the completed fertility years is on the uptick. It's growing rapidly, and so that has an impact on fertility. When you're not adding on the front end of the life course, what happens to the top end? It gets older. Now, I don't want anybody to walk away saying, I'm blaming women for depressing fertility. I got something for you men, too. We think there is a worldwide decrease in the sperm count for environmental reasons, stress, and a whole range of other things. But one of the most telling things about the current period is some most recent research that shows that is an increase in the vasectomy rate among privately insured men age 18 to 64 between 2014 and 2021. Where has this vasectomy increase occurred? Among men with no children, with a wife of advanced maternal age, men who are single, and men 18 to 24. And then there's another most recent study that came out that said this is highly concentrated among men in the military. And so when you put these two things together, it has an impact on fertility. Any honest people in the room born between 1946 and 1964? Let me see a show of hands. These are all the honest people. Look around. There's some dishonest people who are lying. They ain't raising their hand. Those of us who had our hands up were part of the post-World War II hormonal rush in America. It was our fathers who went off to World War II and came back home and got busy. Got busy to the tune of producing 81 million of us. We are the boomers. And on January 1st of 2011, the first baby boomer born in America turned 65 and became eligible for what? Everything. Every day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, from year 2011 to year 2029, we boomers are turning 65 at the rate of 10,000 per day. Every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Look at us. In 2010, we were 45 to 64. See, that 64-year in 2011 becomes 65. See, 81 million, 31% growth rate. You'll note that the second most rapidly growing population was the 65 plus population. Why? Because we don't die, we just multiply in terms of that 65 plus. When you look at the 45 to 64 over there, and the 65 plus, that's called the silver tsunami. Okay? Got a slight problem though, right? Because what happened to the 25 to 44-year-old population? It declined. See, after the baby boom, we had a baby bust. We stopped having children in sufficient numbers to replace ourselves. And you'll note that the under 25 population is growing much slower than us old fuddy-duddies and boomers there, and the total population is growing much slower. That's your workforce challenge, if you will. If you look over here on the right-hand side, to think about this in terms of your region and your competitiveness in the marketplace, you need to take that 65 plus population and unpack it to the youngest old, 65 to 74, the middle old, 75 to 84, and the oldest of the old is 85 plus. You will note if you look at this graphic that the 85 plus population growing at 20% is growing more rapidly than that 45 to 64, the 25 to 40, the under 25 population actually declined because we have such a low fertility rate. Now, that's your workforce challenge. If you're going to have all hands on deck, you got to figure out how to navigate these kinds of challenges with all of the growth that you're talking about that's coming to the region and the like. You got some changes here. And if you look at it we call it the graying of the population. Look at the 65 plus population for the nation grew by 35%, while the total population growing by 7.4%. The under 18 declined. The 18 to 64, the working age population grew by 4%. Bring it forth to the present, 9.4% growth in the older population. You get my point. Where your growth is occurring among these older people and the older adults. For the first time in history, you got 5 generations in the workplace. Everybody from the pre-boomer born in 1945 or early, who's most familiar and loved with the rotary dial phone, to Gen Z that waltzes into work at 10:30 in the morning, if they show up at all. And then there are us boomers who arrive at 5:30 in the morning, because that's the way we roll. And the boomer looks at Gen Z and says, that's a bad work ethic. I'm rolling up in here at 10:30 in the morning. Gen Z looks at the boomer and says, you can't spell work ethic because I finished walking in the door, what you've been navigating at since 5:30. And you look to your left, you look to your right, there's Mr. and Miss pre-boomer still trying to get the first rotary dial call out for the day. And it's you losing $30 million in work productivity every day because every generation thinks they're the best thing since sliced bread. All hands on deck, you need to figure out how to work across those generations in terms of making things happen. So 2 things are going to be really, really important for us. Succession. Sooner or later, those of us who got a little gray on the mountaintop or nothing up there at all, we got to go. Some of us know down to the minute when we're leaving. Others, you're going to have to rent a bulldozer and pull their butts out, but they got to go. And you need to understand that the next generation of talent won't look like what? The old generation. You're going to have to build a far more agile and flexible workforce. Child care won't be your big issue. I didn't say it won't be an issue. It won't be your big issue moving forward. What will it be? It's going to be elder care. And elder care is radically different from child care, right? Child care is actually quite predictable, right, folks? You drop the crumb snatch off at the daycare in the morning. You go pick them up in the afternoon. But elder care, and in particular if you have a loved one with Alzheimer's or dementia, you're going to have to figure out how to do what? Squeeze work in. Everybody in HR circles talks about work-life balance. We kick that out the door. We talk about work-life integration because if you got to deal with an elder care responsibility, you have to figure out how to squeeze work in around that notion. We're talking about a tremendous transformational change in terms of things. What happened in your region? Look at where your growth is by age. You got one population that's growing. Over there, you got preschool, school age, and the working age population all growing. Your senior population is what's growing. That's what I mean by focusing on the challenges at hand in terms of the enormous dividends, economic dividends that you have. You're going to need the talent to do what? Drive that change. Browning and Gregg, moving and grooving, At the same time, population is disappearing and rebelling quickly. Left-hand side of this graphic is a picture of the rates of population growth in our country, a 100-year view from 1920 to 2020 by decade. What you will note in that graphic is that in terms of the rate of growth in our country, we peaked in 1960 when the population grew by 18.5%, and every decade since then, we've been growing slower than that. Some minor perturbations by decade, but in general, we've been growing more slowly since 1960, such that when we grew by 7.4% in the last decade, 2010 to 2020, good people, that was the second slowest rate of growth in our history. When was the slowest rate of growth? During the Great Depression, when we grew by 7.3%. And we're now projecting that that slowing rate of growth is going to continue into the future. It's going to continue into the future. Now, why are we experiencing growth? Look, you could see it coming. We grew by 13% in the 90s, 9.7% 2010, 7.4% 2010 to 2020. Part of the reason we're growing much slower has to do with the way we treat immigrants and our position on immigrants. Immigrants grew by 57% in the 90s, 24% 2000s, 2010 to 2019, 13.7%. When former President Trump was in office, it grew by 2.7%. What you have to understand is that immigration is an age-selective process. Far more young people migrate and immigrate than old people. And the other piece of this, don't repeat this anywhere, you could lose your job. Young people are more likely to have children than old folks. When you put those two things together, that's a part of the source of your growth in our society. And so you need to understand that that's a really crucial period of everything that we have. White population loss is the other thing that's contributing to slowing growth in our population. Whites kind of about 20% of growth in the 90s, 8.2% 2000, 2010 to 2020, zero because of decline. That decline I already showed you by region, and 2010 to 2021 growth as well. The other issue that we have to deal with is what is called the end of men hypothesis. Good news first, women in 2010 were about to surpass men as the numerical majority in the paid workforce in America. The operative term is paid workforce. Women have been working all their lives, but we're talking about in the paid workforce. They were about to surpass men as the numerical majority. But ladies, this wasn't because we decided to treat you all fairly, okay? There's still a huge gender wage gap out there that we have to deal with. Some people say 80 cents on the dollar, 81 cents on the dollar, and the like. Rather, this reality was because men are doing so poorly in American society today. All men. Why? We have selective withdrawal of men from the labor market. Why are they withdrawing? Skills mismatches, disabilities, or incarceration. If you look at the data very carefully, what you will see is the median wage of a young male with less than a college education dropped by 20% since 1969. For males with more than a college education, it went the other direction, and so declining wages. But the big thing for us in our economy is this last bullet on this graphic is a huge sex ratio imbalance in college enrollment that has been around. Look at the data, left-hand side of this graphic, yellow line for men, green line for women. From 1947, college enrollment was 70% male, about 30% female. If you track those two curves over time, you'll see that they coalesced in 1979 and they flipped. Since 1979, the college enrollment has been 60% female, 40% male for almost 4 decades. I assure you at birth, the sex ratio is not 60-40, it's more like what? 50-50. And it doesn't matter what region of the country you look at, it's about 60-40. We've had a whole generation of males that are giving up on college. I don't have data for your school system, but I have it for my own system. I teach in the UNC system. In 2022, we had 240,000 students. It was 40%, let's just say 41% male. The predominantly white schools was 42% male. The minority serving institution was 37% male. The HBCUs were 33% male. We had one school that was 80-20, 80% female, 20% male. If that's enrollment, What happens to graduation? That's just enough. I don't have to do that. We, for a 5-year period, 2017-18 to 2021-22, we graduated 301,000 students. That equated to 59% female. We graduated 56,000 more women than we did men. We got a slight problem because there are not enough eligible, marriageable males to go around if you want to marry at a comparable what? Education level. That has huge implications for marriage, dual learner households, and a whole range of other things that you need to think about as we do this. That whole notion about loss of prime young men, look at it, 20 to 24 years old, population loss, total population loss in the workforce. We're losing a whole generation of men, creating a demographic depression in our workforce that we need to pay attention to. And fertility rates continue to be below replacement level. To understand fertility, if you are a couple, you need to have 2.1 kids to replace yourself, okay? Please don't ask me about the 0.1. 2.1 is to keep the population stable, okay? Not to grow, just to maintain stability. You need to have. What's the total fertility rate for everybody? 1.7. Everybody is below except Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander women. And that's a what? That's a small base population. That's where your loss is in terms of fertility. And these are the latest data by age and fertility, 2022 to 2023. The only group of women during the pandemic that had any children were in their final years having their first child. Everybody younger than that, negative. Those were people who had the money to be able to do it on lockdown and the like. Doesn't matter. The only group that had any children, net gain, was the Hispanic population, and the net gain was 6,536 kids. You forecast that 20 years from now, you think you can compete on 6,500 some kids? Understand the dynamic. When you have fewer births, when you have fewer births than deaths, I mean, deaths exceed births. That's happened first in 2016 for the nation as a whole among whites, and then by 2018, more than half of the states. That was a case, and more deaths than births. That's what it looked like in, including Tennessee, in 2021. You have more deaths than births. So to the extent you grow, it's all migration, it's all immigration and migration. Understand that connection that you have to make things happen. The other thing that's driving your change is these deaths of despair. What am I talking about? Deaths due to opioids, suicides, alcoholism, things of that nature that's creating this demographic depression. That was the opioid crisis in 1999 on the left. That's it in 2014. We lost about 159,000 people in the 90s. We lost 339,000 in 2000 to 2009. 2010 to 2019, we lost 613,000 people to substance abuse deaths or disorders. It's opioids, a lot of it, the uptick here. And then during the pandemic, it went off the rails. We lost 90,000 people in the first year. When you're on lockdown, you can't get to your counseling and that kind of assistance. It proved to be pretty lethal. 90,000 in 2021, we lost another 100,000 people to those deaths. Envision the impact on your workplace. Consider a young person, age 25, becomes chemically dependent and is disabled, and they live to age 50. But they're disabled, they're not working. You've lost 25 years of work contribution there. But that person at birth, their life expectancy at birth was 75. They die at 50. What have you lost? You've lost 50 years of work productivity. What this graphic is how many work life years we lose due to these kinds of changes. And that middle red graph it's not about disability. People die immediately. They're not disabled, they die. immediately. And so you got this creating that demographic depression, that donut in the work. Look at the age structure. Look at the peaks there. They're prime working age people. Understand when somebody tells you that Social Security is a pay-as-you-go system, what does that mean? I'm paying in, but somebody else is spending my money. What needs to happen for me to get something out of the system? All of y'all need to say in unison, we need to be working every day, 4, 5 jobs, to pay into the system to sustain it. But we're losing prime working age people. That's a challenge for us. COVID took a year off, uneven because of the uneven distribution. 3 years off Latino lives, 2 years off Black lives, about 7/10 of a year off white lives. You've already heard this from the previous president, 2 million women forced out by COVID, and we had 1.7 million workers 55 or older who retired involuntarily. They tend to be disproportionately Black and male. They retired involuntarily with a median savings of $9,000. The hardest working generation out there. We got to get them back into the workplace. Encore careers, encore entrepreneurship is something we got to think about for those folks. We got all these people who are working invisible overtime out there that they got either caregiving responsibilities, child care, older care, that makes things really, really work. The rebellious part, we've got labor activism that we've not seen since the 50s and the like. Walkout strikes, resignation, silent quitting, pushback on mandatory return to office things. 3 groups can't participate fully in the return to office mandate: women with young children, people with physical and mental health disabilities, and people with the economic housing crisis, those super communities that keep pushed further and further away from their jobs and the like. So I'm going to wrap here because I know the question for you to remain competitive, to take advantage of the economic opportunity that you have, is on the workforce side, is how do you build workplaces where employees feel like they belong? How do you do that? How do you do that? The old normal is never coming back. You're going to have to figure out how you do this. I'll skip that because we're more prone to discriminate than anybody else in the world. Here's your challenge, the demographic ring. You got slowing total and foreign population growth. You got white population decline. You got declining fertility. You got deaths of despair and declining labor force participation. That's your challenge. It's not unique to you. That's our challenge as a nation. We got to figure out how to do it. But we can do it. I just don't have time to tell you how to do it. I'm going to stop there.